Good day and welcome. I am Cesar Montevecchio. I am the Assistant Director of the Catholic Peacebuilding Network at the University of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, part of the Keough School of Global Affairs. Welcome to this launch event for the Catholic Peacebuilding Network's new book, Catholic Peacebuilding and Mining, Integral Peace, Development, and Ecology, which was edited by me, along with the Catholic Peacebuilding Network's coordinator, Gerard Powers, and which was published in January by Routledge and is available widely as an open access ebook. I would like to start by giving some background on this book project and then introducing the panelists who have joined us today to discuss it. In many of the world's most intractable conflicts, mining is intimately linked to violence, human rights abuses, environmental degradation, unsustainable development practices, and poor governance. From Pope Francis's landmark encyclical Laudato Si to advocacy and grassroots mobilization in Colombia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Philippines, and elsewhere, the Catholic community is deeply engaged in addressing issues related to mining. Unfortunately, this engagement on mining has gone largely unexamined by and is not deeply grounded in Catholic scholarship. Considerable scholarly work has been done on other adjacent and related topics like development ethics and ecology, but relatively little has been done on mining in particular. And even less has taken an integrated approach to the multiple dimensions of the issue and the connections between Catholic teaching and action, especially in relation to peacebuilding. Such integration is the aim of this book. Catholic Peacebuilding and Mining is one part of a larger initiative on mining sponsored by the Catholic Peacebuilding Network. Several years ago, as problems around mining became an increasingly louder refrain among our partners in varied parts of the world, it became clear that mining was an issue we needed to prioritize. In addition to editing this book, we have partnered with colleagues in Colombia on a project to survey Catholic action on mining throughout the country, have participated in sessions sponsored by the Vatican, bringing together mining executives and Catholic and other Christian leaders engaged on mining, and developed a repository of resources mapping Catholic thinking and praxis on extractives, with some other activities slated for the coming years. The specific aim of this book is to fill gaps in the academic literature and better connect that literature to the actual practice of the Catholic community. It does so by taking an integrated approach to mining that examines the connections among a Catholic theology, ethics, and praxis of human rights, integral development, integral ecology, and integral peacebuilding. Our hope is that the integrated approach itself contributes to the further development of Catholic theological and applied ethics, and that the application of this approach to the particular problems associated with mining enables theological and ethical reflection to catch up to Catholic praxis, learn from it, and help develop new frameworks and ideas to strengthen and support it. This integral approach frames the book in three ways. First, it integrates theology and ethics with lived Catholicism by focusing on Catholic praxis in mining. The first section of the book includes essays on Catholic engagement in El Salvador, Peru, Colombia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the Philippines. And then the second section considers these and other cases of praxis in light of broader themes in Catholic theology and ethics. Second, the book considers the importance of relating the local, national, and international dimensions of Catholic engagement on extractives, as well as the various forms of engagement by different sectors within the Catholic community. And third, the book integrates a Catholic peacebuilding perspective across the constellation of environmental, human rights, and other issues surrounding mining, which in most cases have been studied in their own circumscribed realms without sufficient attention to the wider set of issues. In advancing an understanding of the relationship between peacebuilding and these other mining issues, this book enhances the understanding of Catholic peacebuilding's inherently integrative nature and helps leverage the distinct capacity of the Catholic community to address this problem with the complexity it requires. With all this background now in mind, I'd like to go ahead and introduce the panelists who have joined us today. First, we have two of our book contributors, Floerke Scheid, who is an associate professor of theology at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where she teaches interdisciplinary courses in theological ethics through the Theology Department, the Center for African Studies, and the Peace, Justice, and Conflict Resolution Certificate Program. Her research interests include the ethics of political resistance, religious ethics and warfare, African theologies and enculturation, and transitional justice, with particular attention to post-conflict forgiveness and reconciliation. Welcome, Anna. And next, Raymond Offenheiser. Ray is the William J. Pulte Director of the University of Notre Dame's Pulte Institute for Global Development, which is part of the Keough School of Global Affairs, where he is also a distinguished professor of the practice. His research interests and areas of expertise include poverty alleviation, human rights, United States foreign policy, and international development. Prior to joining Notre Dame in 2017, he was the president of Oxfam America for over 20 years, where his work included extensive engagement on issues of mining, development, and justice. Welcome, Ray.
Thank you, Cesar. Nice to be with you.
And finally, we have joining us as a commentator, Father Peter John Pearson, Director of the Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office of the Southern African Bishops' Conference. In that position, Father Pearson helps lead the bishops' public policy advocacy, which in recent years has increasingly involved concerns around mining in South Africa. Father Pearson is a priest of the Archdiocese of Cape Town, from where he is currently joining us, so we are very grateful that he is making time for us at this late hour local time. Thank you, Father Pearson.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I'd like to begin by asking our contributors for some of their insights from their work on the book, and then turn things over to Father Pearson to offer some questions and comments. And we'll have some time allotted at the end for questions from our audience. So Anna, perhaps you can go first, and Ray, feel free to step in right after her. But for both of you, just to kind of to lead off, can you summarize for our audience your own contribution to the book, and then also say a few words about what is your kind of broader takeaway from your involvement with the project as a whole? And so Anna, I'll hand it off to you at that, and then Ray can step in after Anna.
Thank you, Caesar, and thank you for having me as part of the book launch, and congratulations to you and Jerry and everyone who has been involved in this, I think, really important project. To start with your first question about just sort of summarizing my contribution, first of all, my chapter is co-authored with Daniel Scheid, who you'll notice has the same last name as me. He is both my spouse and a colleague. And we provide in the chapter that we worked on for the book a general ethical framework that's founded as a Catholic moral vision growing out of the intersections between Pope Francis's integral ecology and really long-standing ideas in the Catholic tradition about just peace. And we kind of are hoping that that general ethical framework can be used to evaluate particular extractive operations from a Catholic ethical standpoint. And we discuss the 3 P's in our framework: prevention, principles, and practices. So in dealing with prevention, we are addressing questions of whether or how extractives can be part of a sustainable economic development that actually contributes to a just peace, or whether the way in which extractives currently function is more likely to lead to continuing situations of violence. In terms of principles, we talk about respect, which is building a culture that's imbued with an ecological just peace, rather than just sort of piecemeal approaches to discrete outbreaks of extractive related violence. We also talk about restoration, which has to do with rebuilding what I think of as the relationships that constitute the Judeo-Christian idea of shalom from the Bible. So positive relationships, just relationships amongst human beings, between human beings and God, and then between human beings and the rest of God's creation, which is something that we often don't look at in peace building. We look at those first 2, relationship between humans and God, but often not as much, and between human beings themselves, but often not as much relationship to the earth and to the rest of God's creation. And then finally, we look at practices, and this is where we get into some examples as well. So we talk about the peace building practice of nonviolent direct action, using an example of the Tia Maria copper mine in Peru. We talk about the practice of trust building, which involves accountability for harm done, but also shared collaborative work towards an ecological just peace. We talk about imaginative thinking and the Catholic imagination and getting people to think not just in terms of efficiency, but the sheer beauty of eco-sustainability, right? Like, what is it to think about how a wind turbine out on the ocean is powering a respirator that's literally giving that wind as life into the patient of a dying, or into a dying patient in a hospital, right? That sheer poetry of that. And we talk finally about Indigenous peace building and really needing to privilege restorative practices that are already functioning at the local level. In terms of your second question of what I want to kind of, or what I'll continue to take away and what was really powerful for me in working on the book, is it gave me a very a good opportunity to work in an interdisciplinary way with people directly from many other disciplines, and also internationally, to really get a sense of what's happening on the ground around the world in communities that are affected by extractive violence, so that our chapter ends up including examples that draw from South Africa, Liberia, Peru, El Salvador, and the Philippines. And so I come out of this work with a real sense of being a peace builder in a global peace building church that's having a global conversation about extractives and violence. I'll end there and toss it over to Ray.
As before Ray steps in here real quick, I'll just give a quick reminder to everyone. Please feel free to use the Q&A function to ask questions of our panelists. I forgot to mention it at the outset, and so we had a little pause there for a second. I thought I'd give that reminder. So go ahead, Ray.
So pardon me, my screen went blank there for a second for reasons I don't understand. Let me just reiterate Anna's congratulations to you, Cesar, and Jerry on the publication of this book, and to all of our fellow authors. I think it's a nice contribution to a field that I think really can benefit from sort of the kind of ethical perspective and the kind of Catholic perspective that we're bringing to this. And as a practitioner and activist who's been on the ground for most of my career and working at the mine sites, as it were, with these communities, you know, we've always been working alongside actors from the church in many of those contexts. So this is, I think, a nice contribution to all those folks laboring in the vineyards out there who for whom these reflections, I think, will be really important. In terms of my contribution, I am an activist and a practitioner, not an ethicist. And so I was drawing on the experiences I had with Oxfam, where we had basically a large global focus on mining as a sort of an activity that was disrupting development in rural areas in many of the countries where we were working. And and our question was, well, how do we figure out, you know, how to sort of tame this beast, and how do we deal with the kind of conflict issues that often surround these kinds of projects? I started working in the late 90s, early to late 90s on these issues. And if I could just characterize sort of where things were at that point, and maybe the title of my article kind of gives you a sense of where I was trying to go with this piece. It's called The Mining Industry, The Journey from Impunity to Consent. And so a lot of what we saw in the 90s in terms of how these projects were unfolding in many countries was the industry on the ground, and even in sort of at negotiating tables, was somewhat hostile to outside critiques. The executives could be arrogant. They were sort of closed to criticism. They very much viewed themselves as, you know, having the project, owning the property, and working inside the fence. And they didn't really they had very little regard for what was going on, if I could put it this way, outside the fence, in the communities around their projects. They were inhabited by largely engineers and had sort of a linear way of seeing the world, and the way of a little experience in solving complex problems that might arise from the way they were connecting with communities or the impacts they were having on communities. and even had little regard, I think, for the kind of environmental impacts that many of their mines were having, and figured that this was sort of an externality that, you know, governments would take responsibility for, you know, down the line, as it were. And so, and even in the worst cases, you know, we would see, you know, acts of real violence in, you know, in some more remote mining areas where, you know, the history had been you could get away with all sorts of things because nobody was watching. It wouldn't be reported, and oftentimes the police and security forces were operating, you know, together. And so, you know, these kinds of actions could be easily covered up. But what began to happen in the late 90s and early 2000s, where the mining industry was facing a bunch of setbacks. And I'll just offer a couple of examples. The Cajamarca mine, the Yanacocha mine in Cajamarca, Peru, for example, was a place in which there was all sorts of demonstrations and mine closures and violence and killings of people who were accused of being on the mine's property. And Newmont Mining out of Denver found itself, you know, in all sorts of complex situations. There was a mercury spill that poisoned people, and there were people who died from that, and many years later were still affected with all sorts of disease outcomes. There was the Octeni mine in Southeast Asia, around Indonesia, where, in other words, there was another sort of all kinds of accusations about polluting fishing waters off the coast with mine tailings, and in other cases there were dam collapses that affected communities. So the industry was in some sense finding itself at a moment in time when the internet was alive, YouTube became a new phenomenon, and the mining industry felt it couldn't hide anywhere. There was no place on earth where there were not witnesses to so many of these kinds of violations. And so they began to actually, I suppose you might say, have a kind of a coming together to think about, well, how are we going to deal with this? And it forced them, I think, to begin a process, which I try to document in the article, of what I might call ethical transition, where they began to kind of, you know, ask questions of like, you know, do we need social license from communities to operate? And what would it mean to get social license? This was sort of a term they came up with to sort of say, well, you know, we're going to be surrounded by communities and we have to ensure that they like us. Well, they initially approached that as a public relations exercise, not as actually something where they were really actually engaging communities in a long-term discussion about development outcomes, but really just trying to get an okay to start a project. And they presumed that once they got the okay at the beginning, they didn't have to get an okay for expansion or other kinds of things that might affect communities down the road. So it was a rather simplified approach, but it was actually an opening and a recognition that communities then mattered. And then what began to happen later was, you know, water became a major issue around many of these mines. And so environmental impacts became something the mines had to give a lot of attention to, not only inside their own properties, but also downstream where there were fish kills and there was polluted drinking water, and farmers were complaining about quality or accessibility or volume of water that they were getting or not getting. Or in some cases like Cajamarca, the city itself, actually the water supply was being depleted. So you began to see that mines found themselves in situations where they could no longer do business as usual. It was not going to be possible. And they began to see that they had to start looking at a whole range of issues. And this required hiring new people, setting up new divisions, thinking about environmental impacts and having environmental engineers part of their staff. It required that they think differently about community relations and begin to think about stakeholders rather than just shareholders. To think about, you know, the question of, you know, what does social license consist of, and should there be something called free, prior, and informed consent for communities that engage with their companies prior to the first shovel being put in the ground? And do communities, in fact, have a right to actually say no to a large mine? Or should they just be consulted, which is maybe the preference of the mining companies? We'll consult you, but we're not going to give you the right to consent one way or the other because this investment is too large and we don't want to give you that much power. But all of these things began to be sort of issues that were under discussion, and there began to be actual movement in the part of the leading companies, the largest probably what's called oftentimes called the majors, movement on indigenous rights, on free, prior, and informed consent, on human rights more broadly, on things like fiscal justice and taxation. And the companies began also to be, I suppose you might say, put under pressure from investor groups who are now thinking about environmental, social, and governance principles. So what I'm trying to document in the article in some ways is what's this journey been for the mining industry, and how they have, what kind of an ethical transition have they undergone over the last, say 20, 25 years. And personally, I think it's been quite substantial. And the reason I think it's important for those of us who come at this issue from an ethical vantage point is that I think it's an opportunity. I think it's a real opportunity to kind of push hard on these issues and find ways that politically the church, along with others, can actually kind of open more doors and solidify the kind of gains that have been made and deepen the progress in these areas. In terms of, I think what I took away from the project is I don't think I had to be convinced that the moral voice of the church actually mattered, but I think the presence of the church in so many parts of the world, and oftentimes in very remote areas where these projects go on, is a really critical agent in bearing witness to many of the violations often that happen with impunity or through carelessness or whatever that have their origins with these mining companies. These mining companies, however, are large and complex. And I think the other thing that, maybe as I was learning and I maybe was hopefully contributing through this process was, how does the Catholic Church think about the industry beyond the particular mine? Because in some ways, the change process we seek may involve peace building at the mine site, but it also involves changing an industry at the headquarters. And this is where I think some of the kinds of meetings that have been taking place in the Vatican have been really important. I think one of the lessons that comes through from this work is the need to link that local presence of the church to kind of global voice on policy. I think it's also important to think a little bit about, do we, as peace builders, when do we engage? Do we engage when there's conflict, or do we engage even at the notion that there will be a mine in a particular region? Because oftentimes the framework for conflict is created by the way the mine is actually imagined and implemented literally from the first shovel in the ground. And so in some ways we might presume that every mining project is going to lead to conflict, and that the whole issue of conflict and peace building needs to be something that's engaged at the mine site and at the company headquarters from the moment it's a notion. And maybe we haven't done that either as Catholic peace builders or as secular activists, but working together, maybe that's sort of the future we might pursue. So maybe with that, Cesar, I'll pause there.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you very much, Ray, for your thoughts on your work and your thoughts on the book as a whole. That's some very helpful perspective for all of us. So as I said, we want to go ahead and turn now to Father Pearson as a book outsider and let him have the floor for the bit to offer some perspective. And so Father Pearson, just to start, in your eyes, how does this book connect with some of the mining challenges and mining problems that you've been experiencing and working with in South Africa? You need to unmute, Father Pearson.
It's almost midnight, so I just want to add my voice of congratulations to you and Jerry, but also to Anna and Ray for two outstanding chapters, which I really enjoyed and found very thought-provoking. I have three thoughts that I think link with where I'm looking at the discussion from. The one is just the sheer gratitude and relief that we're beginning to craft a coherent narrative around some of these very neuralgic issues which we've lived with for so long, and where we've been on the boundaries and not at the heart of the discussion around bringing justice into the mining sector. The gaps have been so huge that they've prevented, I think, those of us, and the church in South Africa is quite late to this engagement with the mining industry, but where we have these very truncated, very isolated silo-like discussions happening, but no coherent narrative as we do, say, around migrants and refugees and other areas that are equally contentious, but where we've got a coherent narrative. And I think this book in so many ways begins to provide that kind of coherency, which allows us make our argument more robustly and to be on more secure grounds ethically. And so the contestation isn't as strong and as divisive as it's been in the past. I think our narratives around civil society in South Africa when it comes to mining have been only contested. There's been no shared space where we can work together. And there's also been a complete demonization of the other. So, you know, civil society demonizes the mining corporations demonize civil society, people on the ground, activists, small-time players in the field. And so no constructive narrative has been crafted or created. And I see this book as making a significant contribution. I love the way that frameworks have been brought to the fore, enriched by work in other areas. And so that's one area that I think has been vital for the kinds of areas we're dealing with. This emergence of a more coherent narrative, ethics brought into focus, but also in a coherent way. So I'm very grateful for that. I think in any colonial settler community such as South Africa, where its history, the history that made it a pariah of nations for so long, has been one where powerfully intertwined cables have left deep memories and realities of oppression and marginalization. The mining industry has been at the forefront of maintaining that colonial settler society. And therefore, in an era where mining is seeking to be more responsive, taking a more socially responsible role, the kinds of things Ray was talking about, what we have is the long shadow of history looming over the industry. That long shadow of basically a hermeneutic of suspicion and a deep distrust. And that goes, filters through all the layers of interaction in our country. So I was very interested, Anna, to read your comments and would like to perhaps explore this further with you around the actions for building trust. I'm not even able to say for regaining trust because there hasn't been any. We have to build it. It's not something that we had and was lost. So that, and linked to that, whether a kind of mining Truth and Reconciliation Commission needs to happen before people can deal with the distrust in and the suspicions that bedevil this whole area so very vividly. So that's the area that I'm also interested in, that the church is finding it hard to find places to enter that discussion, partly because it's so polarized, partly because we haven't the language to use, and we haven't always had the tools for dealing with issues of suspicion and distrust. The third area is that part of the fallout of that deep distrust and suspicion has been that when mines have done socially responsible things, and I was thinking as I read your characterization of integral ecology in your chapter, Anna, just how intuitively the mines took on many of those criteria relational work, trying to work with the whole spirit of inclusivity, and how this just didn't harness the kinds of responses that one would have hoped for. And in reading your chapter, I realized that part of the problem was that they were trying to fit those very valuable insights and value tools into a fundamentally consumerist model. And that just couldn't fit and make sense together or produce any good fruit. The third area that I think was implicit in just about everybody's contribution to the book was the exploration of what solidarity means in societies that have been affected by mining, by both the impunity and the iniquity of those endeavors, and what that could mean, what voice the church brings into fashioning a discourse around solidarity, and what practices the church can bring into its social witness in this area. I think one of the tragedies of the history of distrust and suspicion is that even where mines have done good things, and I'm thinking of mining in the area of KwaZulu-Natal on the coast of South Africa, where they've sought to do good things, that spirit of contestation and conflict and the desire of people who have been without adequate resources to colonize the resources that have come their way has led to deep conflict within the communities. And communities have been torn asunder by conflicts, not with the miner, but with the, for instance, the trusts that mines have set up for the communities, control of that, access to financial resources, and all of those things. And this has begun to, or it's not begun, this has led into another cycle of violence, but this time within communities, which is terribly destructive. And so those are the three kinds of issues that we're dealing with around mines in South Africa, and that I see the beginnings of really powerful points for reflection emerging in the articles that that we have, and especially the two of my fellow panelists. So Anna, I'd like to discuss and to perhaps think with you about how one grows trust where trust has never existed. And Ray, I'd like to think with you through, well, one or two issues. The issue around how we and what kind of accompaniment we need to be part of alongside the mining companies. What is it that we, once they've done the good things they set out to do, what do we still need to do with them to ensure that we move from impunity to consensus, or consent, or both? What are the benchmarks that need to happen? We won't get it right, but what's the point at which we say we've reached a critical point now? We can talk about consensus. So those would be my two and a bit questions to my colleagues. Thank you.
I think just go ahead, Anna and Ray, if you want to chime in on those, feel free.
So first of all, thank you so much, Reverend Pearson. That was, it's so wonderful when someone's really read through your work and has such thoughtful comments and feedback and questions, and the privilege of being able to kind of talk with someone about that. So I really appreciate it. So I'm interested also in talking with you about this idea of growing trust, because I know that your own history and role in the South African context has included work on reconciliation and truth-telling in the wake of the apartheid regime. And you asked at one point, you said, do we need something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for mining? That would certainly be something I want to be a fly on the wall in the room to hear those stories. I'm also thinking about how a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is telling truths about the past, right? So looking at those deep memories that you spoke of in terms of the colonial harms, and in the case of South African apartheid, the apartheid harms done to people and communities, and lands too. And I don't want to forget lands, because the issue of lands is really important in this book, right? And the ways in which Indigenous peoples are connected to their lands. So harms done to people and lands, and looking at those memories, right? But also, I think a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is looking forward, right? Seeking to repair those relationships with the idea that there's a future to build together. And I'm thinking about that just in terms of Pope Francis's ideas of integral ecology, and the way that we've kind of tried to highlight those, at least in our chapter, and I know they're highlighted throughout the book as well, as really having the scope of millennia on their radar, right? We're not trying to solve these problems or transform these conflicts just for the next couple of decades. We're looking at the way in which some of these harms will affect future generations as well, right? So to think about, when we think about trust building, I think we have to expand that well beyond the people who are right here to build trust with right now. We're trying something totally new, which is to build trust with future generations. And that's quite a trick.
It's the idea of, let's plant the tree, but we won't be around to sit under it.
Right. Definitely. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Father.
Ray. No, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so maybe to pick up on your questions, I think one of the things we maybe need to be thinking about as we think about this question of accompaniment is, who do we have with us that can also be part of our, who can be part of this accompaniment process, that also has knowledge and maybe skills we don't have. I guess one of my concerns about the church is it has moral voice, but it may not have all the sort of technical skills and knowledge of the industry that it needs to be an effective advocate, and even an effective oversight body for the benchmarks that we might create. However, I think one of the other things that's happened, which I didn't mention earlier, but it was kind of implicit, I suppose, is there's been this enormous growth of sophisticated organizations monitoring the mining industry in civil society that are operating globally and now nationally in many contexts. And they're doing many different kinds of things. Some of them are monitoring environmental impacts, and there's a lot of skill that's required in sorting out, are there metal pollutants in a water supply? Is the water supply and hydrological system of a region changing in dramatic ways that undermine the sustainability of that water resource for an entire province in some cases? And how do you actually, measure that sort of thing? How do you understand perhaps the financing of a mining project to determine whether communities that might expect financial investments in their own, public services and roads and schools and clinics, rather than charity from the mining company? In other words, what was often done in terms of corporate responsibility by the mining companies when they began to worry about social license was, we'll build one little school and we'll build one little clinic, which cost them absolutely nothing in terms of the scale of profit and value they were taking out. But in reality, they needed to have a much more robust sort of relationship financially and in investment terms with those communities. And this is what I mean by thinking inside the fence versus outside the fence. In many ways, our accompaniment and maybe as part of our narrative, we need to be thinking about challenging the companies to be not an extractive industry, but a development partner. Mm. And then challenging them to think about what would it mean to be a development partner? What kind of mind shift would that require for a company to be in a region, recognizing that it's not there just to destroy the landscape and extract value for its own purposes, but rather it was there to extract value, leave value, and leave a more sustainable landscape and perhaps a more developed region than it actually found. And how would that actually happen? And there are some companies now that are actually looking at this question of, can we become a development partner? Can we have what in their language they would say, social purpose? And can that be part of our business model in a way that we actually finance and still be viable as a company? And so some of these sorts of, these benchmarks start to become, things like, does the company have sort of a declared social purpose? Does it have a sort of a declaration of itself as a development partner? Does it talk about and engage stakeholders in a region in a meaningful way that is consequential in some fashion or other? I guess some other things that occur to me on this idea of accompaniment is I think one of the things I think has to happen a little bit with the peace building movement is I think it has to kind of join hands with the development movement in some ways. That I oftentimes found that the church was kind of on one path and peace building, and the development community was on another path, maybe more concerned about community engagement and environment, but we weren't intersecting. And yet I think we would have more power if we did come together, and those skill sets can be borrowed and shared in ways that I think would be efficient and economical for all of us. I also wonder whether and to what degree, and I think it's part of the integral human development that Pope Francis is really encouraging us to embrace in a much more robust way, is that sustainability becomes, I suppose you might say, a peace principle, and that we try to document what does it mean for a mine to be sustainable? Because there is a real question about whether mining at all can be a sustainable industry. And what would that look like? And I've been in some really interesting conversations of late with some mining companies that think about the water issue, that they ask questions like, should we, on the closure of a mine after 50 years, have in perpetuity responsibility for the water supply of that region? Now that's, think about that. I mean, that's a financial responsibility that would be theirs for quite a long time. And how would they finance that? And the companies that are thinking about that are actually thinking about the financing of it before they actually ever start the mine, because it involves such a large investment that they would have to build it into the forward planning of the entire mining project. So these are kind of really big questions. And as we go into this 21st century more deeply, I think we're going to see even more mining because of the energy transition we're going through. And we're starting to see it accelerating in Latin America and other places. So I think the kind of work we're doing here and thinking about how to transform this industry is really critical. And maybe the final thing I would just simply say is, where do we do accompaniment? I think we do it at the mine site, to monitor all of these very direct impacts on communities. But I think we also do accompaniment at headquarters, because this is and also of the industry itself. And there are fora where we can transform not one company at a time, but we can transform the principles and ethical standards that the industry is actually using to guide its behavior across the whole industry. Like the International Council on Mining and Metals in London, and there's the IRMA group in New York, and all of those sort of fora where ethical principles are now and new norms are kind of coming up because of all this pressure on the industry. I think we need to be accompanying those processes and really pushing those as far as we can to get those norms to be as friendly to sustainability and communities as we possibly can. And there's not enough time for us to go through all of the different benchmarks that we probably we'd want to list that and also want to achieve. But I think those two places, the mine site and the industry, are places. Those two sites are the places where we ought to probably focus our accompaniment and in a very rigorous way.
Thank you. I just, if I might add a word before I hand back to you, Caesar. I think one of the model that we've been trying to think through in South Africa around our engagement with mining has been the one that Brian Hare articulated some years back, that we have a responsibility in our broad teaching ministry, what we teach around all the things that you both have written about so well, but we also have an accompaniment alongside those who are at the points of leverage, where real power is exercised and where we can have a voice. And that's something we're taking very seriously in South Africa at the moment, even if we're only at the beginning stages. It was inspired by those meetings in the Vatican. And to be present also where the activists are raising questions in very blatant and robust ways. So those three kinds of areas, to try and hold them in sync and try and keep them together. They'll have different emphasis at different times, but to try and keep them together as part of that whole is part of what we're doing. Last thing I want to say is that one of the things we worry about is how many of the mining companies are suffering from a kind of social amnesia. So soon after apartheid, where the memories are still fresh in everybody's mind, companies are saying, well, we weren't part of that. We didn't do that. We never agreed with that, even when their history shows quite definitively that they were. And there's a kind of social amnesty happening, which is also complicating the work we do and the interventions. Thank you.
I have a question I just want to pose to all three of you, really, I guess, and then we do have a couple of questions from the audience that we can run through. But one question I think is an important one to consider. A lot of the conversation has sort of looked at, I think, in a lot of ways, critique of the mining side of this, and I think there's a legitimate and important question to ask in line with how can the church do better. I mean, we have with us, Anna as a theologian, Peter John as a minister, as a pastor, Ray as someone who's been really involved with the high level discussions around this that the church has been a part of. Where are there ways that you think that the church could do better in this? Does the church talk about it enough? Is the church paying enough attention to this? What can the Catholic community do to engage better on this? To be more effective, to be a better advocate, to be a stronger peace builder in this area?
I think one thing I'd say off the cuff, and I think Vincent Miller speaks about it in his chapter, is that this is still seen as a completely elitist conversation. It's just between people who have knowledge or insights, who can read, you can read financial reports and so forth. So it's a very elitist conversation, except in those few communities that are around mines, where people are directly affected and, where it's raised in pastoral concerns, such as the waves of violence that are often unleashed, such as polluted water, where justice and peace groups and other social activists take up the issues. But I think as a broader church issue, it's still seen as, and kept, I think we're guilty of keeping it as a conversation between elites. So that would be one area that we would need to deconstruct if we going to ensure that the influence lies in many locales and has the power then to be brought together. But I think it's the deconstruction of the elite conversation.
I would offer that well, first of all, I would argue that what we're dealing with to some degree is an issue of, of asymmetrical power between mining companies and the communities that surround them, and oftentimes even the nations in which they are operating. I mean, we've had companies sue whole countries for $300 million for because the country decided that a particular project wasn't welcomed in their particular country, and then these were cases that were in court costing countries millions and millions of dollars. I think there are opportunities, however, if we think about this from a power standpoint, where we have to ask the question, are we at the right tables as the church? And are there tables we should be at where important normative and ethical questions are being discussed that will be translated into policy that will affect the operations of the industry and particular mining companies well into the future? And these may be the sort of industry-wide trade associations on occasion. They may be shareholder meetings on occasion of particular mines that are maybe egregious violators of human rights and other sort of ethical standards, where you're actually, you are bearing witness in a particular way. And one of the amusing things that we did at Oxfam, I was thinking about how the church can be present. There's lots of different ways the church can be present. At Oxfam, one of the things we did is we would put we would put shareholder resolutions forward at shareholder meetings for major corporations, and we would accumulate votes from shareholders from the religious orders. So we would go into shareholder meetings with a resolution for the company to accept free, prior, and informed consent as a policy, and with the Sister of Mercy's, retirement funds as our voting proxy, and we had more votes. We had enough votes to get that on the ballot. And when it gets on the ballot, it has to be voted on from the floor, which for the company, is not something that they often like to see happen. So and that's an important way of bearing witness. And I've been in situations where at Oxfam, what we would do in terms of maybe your point about elitism is we would bring the residents from those communities to the stockholder meeting, and they would actually present the resolution from the floor in their voice. So There's lots of different ways this can be done. And this is why I think, this may not be something that the church itself may be best equipped to do, but this is where the partnerships with the global civil society networks that have become very sophisticated about this is where they can help. And this is where, and this is where, again, the moral voice of the church is extremely important. So those of us who don't necessarily have that moral voice as activists, we benefit from the fact that the church is standing with us or, beside us. And Father, I should tell you, and I told Cesar the story, is that the first executives meeting at the Vatican that we had was a product of a kind of an odd conversation I had in Brazil at a meeting with industry leaders trying to figure out the future of the industry. And the last panel of the day was basically an effort to kind of look at what are the strengths, weaknesses, and threats to the industry. And I was the only non-industry person on the panel. And I made this comment that, in effect, when they were talking about threats, I said, well, one of your greatest threats is the Catholic Church. And you would have, these guys were in shock. This was like not on their radar screen. And then the second thing I said was that, maybe Bill Clinton was another threat, because Bill Clinton was starting to look at mining and some of the environmental issues. Well, after that meeting, I was approached by the CEO of Anglo Gold Ashanti, who basically said, I was stunned by that comment. What did you mean? And I explained. I said, well, everywhere you operate, there's a little parish nearby, and there's a priest who's kind of getting sort of stories to, being told to him in the rectory about, what the future looks like with this mining company. And those stories are going into a larger kind of conversation at the Vatican, and the Vatican is paying attention. And he then asked me to set up that first meeting at the Vatican. That's how it happened.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
So this is where presence at the right tables actually matters. And so, but you have to have an entity, say, in the Vatican that's thinking about how are we coordinating the local to the global? What are the strategic tables we need to be at? and how do we want to be there so that we're not elitist, but we are both, we're representative of the people we serve, and we're representing the best intellectual capability and best narrative that we can present. I hope that's a helpful way of thinking about it.
Very helpful. And thank you for the historical background.
Well, I know we're close to our time, but I'll say I appreciate very much that focus on the imbalances of power, Ray, that you mentioned, and that idea of what table are we sitting at. And in one of the kind of pre-conversations that Caesar and I had about this, he mentioned he sort of asked or posed the question of whether or not there are certain principles of Catholic social teaching that we need to be revising or rethinking or retooling in the light of these conversations around extractives and violence. And one of the things that comes to mind for me is we've talked for several decades now in the church about a preferential option for the poor, which for anybody who might be listening and who isn't really familiar, is a principle of Catholic social teaching that says every decision we make, whether we're making it on a personal level or at an institutional level or at a government level, ought to be made in light of how it affects the poorest and most vulnerable among us, and no decision should be made that harms the poorest and most vulnerable among us. And I can't help but think that in this context of mining and violence, we need to tweak that to talk about a preferential option for indigeneity, or for the indigenous. So that's going to be the forgotten people that I kind of keep lifting up in this conversation, because so often when those contracts are being signed to do mining in a particular area, it's the local population that's left out of that conversation. It's the national government and the multinational corporation, without attention to the local or the regional people who are going to basically be actually most deeply affected by the situation. So preferential option for indigeneity would say, are we making a decision here that is harming these people? And if so, we need to step back and rethink that.
On that note, that one of the chapter we have on Peru, and I think I see Sister Pat Ryan, I think, is attending here, and she works with the organization that did our chapter on Peru, and they told a note similar to, feeds into the point you're making about the indigenous, where the free, prior, and informed consent requires companies to put a notice in 2 newspapers, and that fulfills their obligation in some of the areas where they're operating in Peru. And the people who are in indigenous communities wouldn't know the language the newspapers are printed in and wouldn't even see them to begin with. And so that's, one of those examples of how you have a structure like FPIC in place and there's regulations, but you see how poor they're executed and how much they don't work for the indigenous, the most vulnerable that are among us. We do have a couple audience questions that, well, we have about a minute left. Our critique of the church went a little bit longer, which I guess is good. So I guess maybe we should just kind of put a bow on things as we come to a close on the time. I think some of these questions are things that hopefully I think some of our conversation at least touched on and addressed. Some really hard questions here about how do we actually implement some of these ideas we're talking about. And I think, Ray, you've given us some insight about how in some part to think about those kinds of things, and at least pointing us in some directions to think about how it can happen. And a question here about the life cycle, like how do we think about FPIC when we're talking about a mine that's going to be there for a generation, for 25, 50 years? And what does it mean if the later generations will look back and say, hey, we wouldn't have consented to this, and the early generation did? And a lot of thorny questions around those kinds of things, about how you really think about how you stop thinking about the community as a monolithic thing, right? When you talk about free, prior, and informed consent in the community, sometimes the community doesn't agree. And so how do you adjudicate that part of it, and how much more complex and difficult it can get? So hopefully we've touched on some of these audience questions, but we are coming to our time. I want to thank especially Father Pearson for being with us this late in the day for you, and for putting the effort you did into going through the book to generate your ideas and questions. And Anna and Ray, your efforts throughout this project and the energy you put into your chapters and contributions and your time and thoughts with us here today. Very, very grateful and very, very thankful. Again, for everyone, the book is available as a free open access ebook. It doesn't need to be purchased, doesn't need to be bought, doesn't need to be ordered and shipped. You can find it online and read it for free from anywhere in the world, as long as you can get the internet. It was important for us to do that so that it would be available to anyone, anywhere, without having to go through any hassle or trouble. And so it can be a widely available resource for all folks. So thank you to our audience. Thank you for those of you who came and attended and listened to us. And hopefully you learn more about the book and it drew some interest. And go read it. Hopefully people can go get their hands on those e-files and download them and read them and find some good value in it. And so thank you, Ray. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Peter John. And thank you all of you in our audience who came to attend today. We're grateful and appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Cesar.
Thank you. Thank you.